the past, addresses the complexities of the present, and projects an alternative image into the future. So somehow, this element of creativity, which you find among smugglers, because smugglers, I can tell you, are very creative people. Smugglers, those who come under the negative label of, criminals, these people are already thinking way out of the box and stretching the logic of identity construction in a way that nation states do not seem to be able to deal with. So, as someone who's actually studying Southeast Asian history today, I find this interesting. Simply because Southeast Asia, for me, is a project in the making, and any historian should, I believe, write history, particularly deconstructive history, with the knowledge that history as a text is a narrative that doesn't have a full stop. Can we, in Southeast Asia today, write that sort of history? I suppose that's the question I want to end with. Can we write a deconstructive history? Can we stop writing a colonizing history, be they history of states or communities or even personal histories? Can we stop writing a colonizing history that continually makes exclusive and permanent claims on things which cannot be exclusively and permanently claimed anyway? The recent quote-unquote cultural disputes that we've had in Southeast Asia, particularly when Indonesians have been shouting at Malaysia primarily and Singapore secondarily for doing nasty things like stealing their batik, is an interesting example. By the way, I often lecture in Indonesian universities, and I really like lecturing at Indonesian universities because a few years ago my students would always come into the lecture room smelling of kerosene. They've just been burning the Malaysian flag before that. and I always find this interesting to see how our societies get so galvanized and agitated about these things. That's precisely because we are still victims of this colonizing history. And the way Indonesia, for example, recently made the exclusive claim on batik to UNESCO, which is of course now the world court that decides who belongs to what, making this claim on batik as something exclusively Indonesian is less an appeal of the Indonesian peoples, but rather something that conforms to the logic of nation states and the way they colonize things. And so a lot of my work when I'm in Indonesia, because I also lecture there occasionally, is to remind Indonesians of the fact that things like batik don't just belong to Indonesia. Batik was the lingua franca of Southeast Asia. It was something worn by all communities. Europeans wore batik. The Peranakan Chinese, the Peranakan Arabs, the Peranakan Indians, all not only wore batik, but produced batik. Also produced batik. And it was the common lingua franca, in the same way that Bahasa was also the lingua franca. Also, this is an interesting side note, yeah? Remember, today we call these two languages Bahasa Malaysia and Bahasa Indonesia. But after the 19th century, you don't call them Bahasa Malaysia or Bahasa Indonesia. It was just called Bahasa. It was called the language. Do you speak Bahasa? Yeah, because I speak the language. I speak the language of the region. Today, of course, Bahasa has been colonized by states. So you have Bahasa Indonesia, Bahasa Malaysia. In the context of Singapore, you call it Bahasa Melayu. So communities make claims on things which cannot be claimed. So can we get out of this logic of claiming? Can we stop colonizing our past for the immediate political needs of the present? I suppose that's what I'm really trying to advocate in, not only the things I write, but also in my political activism, i.e. an attempt to rethink a notion of subjectivity and political subjectivity that does not, remain confined in neatly corralled parameters with neatly defined borders that actually divide us as peoples. Now, all of this, of course, need not necessarily bring us to some happy land in the past. I can't condemn teleology and just replace it with another teleology. I'm not saying that deconstructive history in the end makes us happy. I'm not saying that deconstructive history will make us understand each other or even like each other better. That's not history's job, by the way. Yeah? The historian is not like I said, not a psychotherapist. It's not the historian's job to make people like each other. But it is the historian's task. It is the historian's task to record. So I'll end with this note. La Capra, when writing about the schools of history, identified two basic schools, what he calls documentary history and what he calls constructive history. Constructive history is basically similar to deconstructive history, i.e. to write the history of the construction of ideas, whereas documentary history is basically the mundane, routine collection of facts. I believe that we can do both. We can be, scrupulously going through every space, every part of our past in order to record as much information as possible, while at the same time noting that this process of recording and writing was a constructive process all the way. I suppose what I'm saying is that history does have a role to play in all this, but it is a history that has to be written in an artistic sense, not in the sense of giving artistic license to historians to write, unreflective histories, but rather to give liberty to historians to recognize the fact that history writing is a constructive process, and in the process of doing so, to interrogate not only themselves, their agency in writing of history, but also to interrogate the agency that went into constructing the facts that they're collecting. Basically, I believe that we are, at this stage, in a better position than ever to attempt such a project. And this is going to be the endeavor not of states really, but of scholars and academics and artists. This is the time when we in Southeast Asia can actually apply our rational agency to actually try to reconnect with the past, to once again open up a Southeast Asia that is home to all. And because I suppose I carry with me the latent fear of ethno-nationalism, particularly when it runs rampant, looking at the trends of Southeast Asia today, particularly in some countries in Southeast Asia where ethno-nationalism, a very narrow form of ethno-nationalism, seems to be taking root and getting louder and louder, I would also argue that this is a task not only worthy of historians, but also necessary for historians and scholars today. So I've overstepped my mark, I've gone beyond the descriptive to the prescriptive. For me, this is something we ought to do. It is not only an academic obligation on our part, but as Levinas says, it is also an ethical obligation on our part. Knowing and reconnecting with our past, with respect, having the courage to recognize that Singapore was not constructed by Stamford Raffles or Fakuha out there, but that Singapore is a contested land, historically and in the present, that it has a history that goes way back beyond the artificial genesis point that we get in official Singaporean historiography, I believe is both an academic obligation on our part and also a moral, ethical obligation out of respect to the ancestors of our past who cannot speak to defend themselves. And I think in the process of doing so, we in Southeast Asia will become richer as a result. We become richer when we recognize that Singapore was Singhapura, a Hindu-Buddhist polity in the 8th century at the time of other states like Srivijaya and Lampasuka, that was actually part of a broader template, a broader geography of transnational contact and interaction. I believe it is actually beneficial for a country like Malaysia to recognize its Hindu-Buddhist past, and that its history did not begin with the emergence of Muslim Malacca in the 15th century alone, but that it has a history going all the way back to Lankasuka, Trambalinga, Takula, which connects it to a broader world, including India of the Gupta dynasty. So I think in the long run, fraught though this may be, and unpopular though this might be with some politicians or people of a certain ideological bent, I believe in the long run, though this is a difficult enterprise, it is something that I think will enrich all of us in the long run. So with that in mind, I suppose I'm preaching here at this point, and even preachers have to stop at one point. I leave you with that thought, and to remind you again of the story of Mr. Raffles and his singer, which he's still looking for, and I look forward to the questions and discussion we will have. Thank you.
Thank you, Farish, for a very eloquent and interesting talk. Advocating a project with very interesting consequences. Farish, as he said, will be happy to take questions.
I'm concerned about I guess in limited time, I'm concerned about the delineation of your ideas. That, of course, I think you're limited by the time that you have. Because I'm wondering what is really the power or the necessity of history to understand the topic that you define it. Because there are so many other things that don't fit easily into the definition of what is history, writing of history. Let me give you a few examples. I went to visit a so-called Orang Asli village in Bunukoc in Vietnam. And it has a longhouse, and the ethnography struck me as almost identical to Sarawak. And then, of course, I realized that it's all part of the Austronesian migrations and so on. And then I saw some photographs of the royal family